The restaurant was a fortress of mahogany and crystal. At the party, my wife spoke German with her boss. I smiled politely, pretending I didn't understand. She touched her stomach and said in German, "Don't worry. The idiot thinks the baby is his." I lifted my glass and replied in fluent German, "The wine is excellent, Albert, but your timing is amateur." The silver hair on Albert's head seemed to stiffen. Cassidy's hand froze against her emerald silk dress. The music played on. I watched the light die in her eyes. It was a slow, agonizing drain of color. Albert tried to adjust his silk tie, his fingers trembling against his throat. He looked like a man drowning in a shallow pool of his own making. I took a slow sip of the Riesling. The acidity cut through the heavy scent of roasted duck. My grandmother had taught me German during long summers in the valley. I had never told Cassidy. Silence was always my sharpest tool. The table felt like a cold slab between us. Other guests laughed nearby, unaware of the blood on the floor. I placed my glass down with a soft, hollow click. Cassidy finally tried to speak, her voice a thin wire about to snap. She claimed it was a joke, a mistranslation I had surely mangled. Her eyes searched mine for the familiar safety of my gullibility. She found only stone. I checked my watch while she rambled. The second hand ticked like a closing cell door. I stood up and leaned over the white tablecloth. My shadow swallowed Albert's plate. I told them both that my lawyer would be calling before dessert arrived. Albert's face turned a mottled, bruised purple. He started to mention his influence and my career. I simply laughed. It was a quiet, jagged sound that stopped the breathing of everyone at our table. I pulled a small digital recorder from my blazer pocket. The red light blinked like a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the dim room. We walked to the parking lot in a heavy, suffocating silence. The night air was sharp enough to draw blood. Cassidy grabbed my arm, her nails digging through the wool of my sleeve. She began to cry, but the tears looked like stage makeup under the amber streetlights. I didn't pull away. I just looked at her hand as if it were a strange, pale insect. I told her I had already moved my things. Her grip failed. The sound of her keys hitting the pavement echoed. I got into the car and locked the doors. The engine purred with a cold, mechanical indifference. Cassidy stood in the rearview mirror, a small figure shrinking into the dark. I realized then that I didn't feel the weight of a broken heart. I felt the lightness of a ghost leaving a haunted house. I drove toward the city lights, leaving the wreckage behind. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a message from my bank. The joint account was officially empty. The hotel room was a sterile box of beige and static. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed, staring at the physical evidence spread across the desk. The financial records were a map of my own blindness. I saw the hotel charges at the Meridian appearing every Thursday like a clockwork pulse. Cassidy had been hiding her life in the open. She used our shared calendar to track her sins. My hands remained steady despite the quiet rage. I opened my laptop to dig deeper into the shared accounts. The digital footprints were messy and arrogant. I found an email folder hidden behind a generic label. Albert's name appeared in hundreds of threads. They weren't just discussing their affair. They were discussing me as a financial asset to be managed. They planned a 10-year timeline of deception. I read the words psychological dependency next to my name. My stomach turned with a violent, cold nosy. The most recent message was from 3 days ago. Albert had detailed his excitement about the Seattle trip. He knew I would be away when the child was conceived. They had used my conference schedule to time their betrayal with scientific precision. Cassidy responded with a laughing emoji that looked like a jagged tooth. She called me her safe harbor while planning to scuttle the ship. I felt the last shred of my old identity finally snap and die. A soft knock at the door broke the heavy silence. I didn't move as the handle turned slowly. Cassidy stood there, looking fragile in the harsh hallway light. She had scrubbed her face clean of the gala makeup. Her eyes were red and swollen from a calculated performance of grief. She stepped inside without an invitation. The scent of her expensive perfume fought the room's industrial cleaner. She looked at the printed emails on the desk. Her breath hitched. "You weren't supposed to see those, Tim," she whispered. Her voice lacked the sharp edge of her German mockery. She tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. I told her I knew about the Meridian and the bracelet. She didn't deny it anymore. Instead, she claimed Albert had pressured her into the plan. She said she was scared for her career. The lie was a flimsy veil. She was still trying to manage me like a specimen. "I'm pregnant, Tim. You can't just walk away from a family," she said. Her hand drifted back to her stomach in that practiced motion. I stood up and turned the laptop screen toward her. I showed her the medical portal with her true conception dates. The math was a brutal, undeniable executioner. She went pale as the realization hit her. I wasn't the idiot anymore. I was the one holding the ledger. She looked at me with genuine naked terror. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had memorized. Albert's wife, Helena, answered on the second ring. I told her I had a dossier of her husband's secret Thursday meetings. Cassidy tried to grab the phone, but I blocked her with a stiff arm. The power balance shifted with a final, audible click. Helena's voice was like ice as she asked for the hotel address. I realized then that Cassidy wasn't just losing a husband. She was losing her protector. The hotel room air grew heavy as Helena Richter listened. I spoke with a quiet, measured cadence that left no room for doubt. Cassidy collapsed into the single armchair, her face buried in her shaking hands. Every piece of data I offered was a nail in Albert's professional coffin. Helena did not scream or gasp. She simply asked for the digital copies of the hotel receipts and the medical dates. Her cold efficiency was more terrifying than any loud, emotional outburst. I hit the send button on the prepped email. The soft chime of the sent notification echoed against the beige walls. Cassidy looked up, her eyes wide with a new, frantic desperation. She realized that her alliance with Albert was now a liability. If Helena moved against him, Albert would drop Cassidy to save his own skin. I watched her reach for her phone, but I took it from the desk first. I knew she wanted to warn him. "You can't do this to the father of my child," she whispered. Her voice was a ragged shadow of its former self. I stood by the window, looking at the streetlights below. I told her that the father of her child had already budgeted for her eventual replacement. I revealed the emails about the other women Albert was keeping in luxury apartments. Her jaw tightened as the reality of her unique status dissolved. She was just one of many secrets. The pressure in the room shifted when my laptop chimed again. It was an automated alert from the corporate server I still had access to. Someone was purging the files related to the Seattle trip. Albert was already panicking and trying to cover his tracks. He didn't know I had mirrored the drive hours ago. My technical precision was finally paying off in ways he couldn't predict. I possessed the only remaining evidence of his massive financial fraud. "What do you want, Tim?" Cassidy asked. She sounded exhausted and small. I told her I wanted the truth recorded on video for my lawyers. I set my phone on the desk and hit the record button. She hesitated, looking at the blinking red light. I mentioned that Helena was already on her way to the restaurant to confront Albert publicly. The threat of total social ruin was the final push she needed to break her silence. Cassidy began to speak, her confession flowing like a bitter, dark river. She detailed the 2 years of lies and the planned deception. She admitted the baby was Albert's, and that they intended to drain my savings. Every word was a jagged blade cutting through our shared history. I felt a strange, hollow sense of relief as the air cleared. The performance was finally over. I stopped the recording and tucked the phone safely into my pocket. A sharp, rhythmic pounding started at the hotel door. It wasn't the police or Helena. It was the hotel manager, looking pale and nervous. He told me there was a man downstairs demanding to see his wife. Albert had bypassed the security and was currently in the lobby. He was shouting about a stolen phone and a breach of privacy. I looked at Cassidy and saw a flicker of her old loyalty return. She knew the beast was at the door. I moved to the door and engaged the heavy security bolt. The sound of Albert's muffled rage echoed through the thin wood. He pounded again, the vibrations rattling the cheap plastic room key on the dresser. Cassidy shrank back against the window, her hands covering her mouth. She looked trapped between the man she betrayed and the one who owned her. I checked the hallway through the small peephole. Albert's face was twisted and dangerously red. "Open this door, Tim," Albert roared from the hallway. His voice had lost all traces of European sophistication. I didn't answer him. I simply opened the laptop and pulled up the reel, time feed from his company's offshore accounts. I watched the numbers fluctuate as Helena's lawyers began freezing his assets. The power he relied on was evaporating in seconds. I turned the screen so Cassidy could see his digital life bleeding out. She looked physically ill. I stepped closer to the door but kept the chain engaged. I told Albert that Helena was already reviewing his secret apartment leases. The pounding stopped instantly. A thick, heavy silence followed my words. I could hear his ragged breathing on the other side of the oak. He knew the game had changed. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the one being liquidated. I felt a cold, mechanical satisfaction. The engineer had fixed the leak. "You're finished?" "Albert," I said through the crack. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told him the federal authorities had received the tax dossiers an hour ago. He started to plead, offering me money he no longer possessed. It was a pathetic display of a broken man. I looked at Cassidy and saw her expression shift from fear to disgust. Her golden goose was plucked and ready for the fire. The illusion was gone. The hotel security guards finally arrived to escort him away. I watched through the peephole as they grabbed his expensive sleeves. He didn't fight them. He looked old and defeated under the flickering hallway lights. Cassidy sat on the bed and asked what happened next. I told her the truth was the only thing left. I packed my laptop and the printed records. I didn't look at her. I was done being her audience. She was alone. I walked past her toward the exit. She asked where I was going at this hour. I told her I had a meeting with a private investigator. Marcus had found something new in the Seattle records. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. There was a third name on the lease of the Meridian suit. I saw Cassidy's eyes dart toward her purse. She was hiding a second phone. The web was larger than I had first imagined. I reached for her bag before she could move. I pulled out the burner phone and saw a series of texts. They were not from Albert. They were from my own brother Mark. The betrayal hadn't started at the office. It had started at my own family table. I felt a new, sharper blade of ice settle in my chest. Cassidy started to laugh, a jagged and high sound. The game was far from over. I was surrounded. The burner phone felt hot in my palm. The blue light of the screen illuminated Mark's name across the top of a dozen messages. My brother had been feeding Cassidy information about my work travel for months. He had provided the logistical cover for every meeting at the Meridian. I looked at Cassidy as she leaned back against the headboard. Her fear had vanished, replaced by a cruel, predatory confidence. The betrayal was a family affair now. I stood in the center of the room while the world tilted. My objective was simple. I had to disconnect from this toxic web before they could lock me out. I reached for my laptop, but Cassidy kicked the power cord loose. She told me that Mark had already changed the recovery passwords on our joint accounts. My own brother had locked me out of my life while I was busy fighting Albert. I was losing my financial oxygen. I ignored her and pulled a backup drive from my pocket. It was the mirrored server data I had secured earlier that evening. I plugged it into the laptop and bypassed the primary security layer. The room stayed silent as the progress bar crawled across the screen. Cassidy watched me with narrowed eyes, her thumb hovering over a call button. She didn't realize that I knew Mark's password habits better than anyone. He always used our childhood street name. The screen flickered and the files opened. I found a hidden folder labeled with Mark's initials. Inside were wire transfers from Albert's offshore accounts to my brother's private firm. Mark wasn't just helping Cassidy. He was being paid to facilitate the destruction of my marriage. He had sold me out for a series of 5-figure payments. The power balance shifted as I copied the bank statements. I finally had the leverage to destroy his career too. "You think you're so smart, Tim," Cassidy spat. Her voice was like broken glass. I told her that Mark's professional license would be gone by morning. I showed her the evidence of the illegal kickbacks. She tried to snatch the laptop, but I shoved her back with a firm shoulder. I wasn't playing the protector anymore. I was a man protecting his own survival. I felt the last of my brotherly loyalty evaporate into the stale air. I moved toward the door, gripping my bag tight. I told Cassidy that Helena Richter was already at the police station. She was filing a conspiracy charge that would include everyone in this room. Cassidy's confidence finally crumbled into a new, jagged panic. She realized that Mark wouldn't be able to save her from a federal investigation. I walked out into the hallway without looking back. The elevator doors slid shut on her screaming my name. I reached the lobby and saw Marcus waiting near the exit. He looked grim as he pointed toward a black sedan idling at the curb. I saw my brother sitting in the driver's seat. He wasn't there to apologize or explain. He was holding a thick manila envelope and watching the doors with a hollow, hungry expression. I realized then that they had one final card to play. Mark stepped out of the car with a smirk. Mark stood by the sedan with his hands deep in his pockets. The fluorescent lights of the hotel driveway made his smirk look oily and yellow. He tapped the manila envelope against his thigh with a rhythmic, taunting thud. Marcus stepped closer to me, his hand hovering near his jacket. I felt the cold night air rushing into my lungs like shards of glass. My own blood was standing there, ready to bury me for a payout. It was a brutal, final clarity. "I have the paternity results, Tim," Mark said. His voice was smooth, carrying the same fake empathy he used at Christmas dinners. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the envelope and held it out. He claimed the test proved I was the father after all. It was a desperate, last-minute gambit to keep me tethered to the lie. If I believed I was the father, I would stop the legal onslaught. He needed me to be the hero again. I didn't reach for the paper. I knew Mark's firm specialized in document forgery for high-stakes corporate litigation. He had the tools and the motive to create a masterpiece of fiction. I told him I had already seen the medical portal records directly from the clinic. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. The wind kicked up, whipping the edges of his expensive coat. He looked at Marcus and realized I wasn't alone anymore. He was losing his leverage. I pulled my own phone out and showed him the wire transfer logs. I pointed to the specific account numbers that linked him to Albert's offshore shell companies. Mark went perfectly still. The arrogance evaporated from his posture, leaving a hollow, frightened shell. I told him that Helena Richter's lawyers were currently tracing every cent of that money. He was no longer just a bad brother. He was a co-conspirator in a federal racketeering case. The hunter was officially the prey. Mark took a step back toward the car. He tried to claim he was only trying to protect the family name from a scandal. I laughed at the pathetic lie. I told him the family name died the moment he took Albert's silver. I watched him scramble to get back into the driver's seat. He realized that I had already sent the evidence to the State Bar Association. His career was a sinking ship in deep black water. He slammed the car door shut. The sedan roared to life and sped away into the night. I turned to Marcus and asked if the courier had arrived yet. He nodded and pointed toward a nondescript bike messenger waiting by the curb. I handed the sealed thumb drive containing the mirrored server data to the bike messenger. It was the final insurance policy against my brother's desperation. The courier took the drive and disappeared into the city traffic. I felt the pressure in my chest finally begin to lift. We walked back toward the lobby to settle the bill. I saw Cassidy standing by the elevators, her bags packed in a frantic heap. She looked at me with a mixture of hatred and absolute defeat. She had overheard the confrontation with Mark. She knew her second safety net had just been cut. She asked me where she was supposed to go now. I told her the truth was her only destination. I didn't feel a single spark of pity. I settled the hotel charges with a credit card that Mark hadn't managed to block yet. The transaction went through with a soft, mechanical beep. I told the manager to call a cab for the lady by the elevators. I was done paying for her luxury, but I wouldn't leave her in the street. It was a final, cold mercy. I walked out of the hotel for the last time. My objective was complete. I was officially a ghost to them. Marcus drove me toward the downtown district. He asked if I was ready for the next phase of the investigation. I told him I needed 24 hours of absolute silence. I watched the city lights blur into long neon streaks against the window. I felt like a man who had just survived a plane crash. Everything was broken, but I was still breathing. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a deep, aching exhaustion. I needed to find a new place to stay. We stopped at a red light near the old bridge. My phone buzzed in my pocket with an alert from an unknown number. I opened the message and saw a grainy photo of the door to the downtown loft I had just rented. Someone had spray-painted a single German word across the wood in red. Veriter. Traitor. I realized then that Albert wasn't the only one with connections to the street. The war wasn't over. It had simply moved to my new front door. I stared at the image on my phone, the red paint on my door looking like a fresh wound. The word "verter" burned into my retinas. Albert was still in holding, awaiting the federal charges to be read, yet his reach still brushed against my throat. Marcus saw my face and pulled the car to the curb. He didn't ask questions. He simply reached into his glove box and handed me a heavy, cold metal object. I checked the safety. The weight of it felt honest and final. We approached the apartment building with a tactical, predatory silence. The lobby was empty, the air smelling of old floor wax and cheap ozone. I pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator hummed a low funeral tune as we ascended toward the threat. My objective was to reclaim my sanctuary and find out who had been compromised. I felt the sweat cooling on my neck. The doors slid open with a soft, indifferent chime. The hallway was a tunnel of yellow light and long, dancing shadows. There it was. The red paint was still tacky, dripping slowly down the dark wood grain like thick blood. I scanned the corners for a camera or a trap. Marcus signaled me to stay back while he checked the lock. It hadn't been forced. Someone had used a key to get inside, and I knew the only other spare was missing from the hook in my kitchen. My heart hammered against my ribs. I realized I was no longer safe anywhere. We entered the unit with our backs to each other. The living room was exactly as I had left it, except for a single item. A German nursery book sat in the center of my desk. It was open to a page about a father and his son. I had never seen the book before. It was a physical manifestation of the psychological war they were waging. The subtext was clear. They wanted me to know that my privacy was a joke. I walked to the kitchen and saw a small, blinking light beneath the counter. It was a high-grade listening device, the kind used in corporate espionage. My own brother, Mark, must have planted it during the move. He had been listening to my every move, every phone call, and every plan. The realization made me feel physically ill. I wasn't just being watched, I was being broadcast to my enemies. I felt a new, jagged edge of cold fury. Mark is still in the city. Marcus whispered, checking a tablet. He had traced a signal to a nearby parking garage. I told him we were going. I didn't want a lawyer or a court order anymore. I wanted the man who had sold his own flesh and blood for a seat at Albert's table. I grabbed the nursery book and tore the pages out one by one. I was done being a victim. I was the hunter now. The parking garage was a concrete tomb of echoing engines and cold wind. We found Mark's sedan idling on the third level. He was slumped over the steering wheel, his face buried in his hands. He looked like a man who had finally realized the bridge was out. I tapped the glass with the barrel of the pistol. He jumped, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He looked at me with a pathetic, hollow hope. I showed him the bug. I had no choice, Tim. Mark stammered as he rolled down the window. His voice was a thin, trembling reed. He claimed Albert had threatened to bury his firm in lawsuits. He said he was protecting me by staying close to the enemy. It was the same old song of the coward. I told him he had 10 minutes to give me the master codes to the offshore accounts. If he refused, I would drop the hammer. He started to type. The laptop screen flickered with a list of encrypted files. Mark handed it over, his fingers shaking so hard he dropped the mouse. I saw the names of 3 other men involved in the fraud. One of them was a high-ranking city official. The conspiracy wasn't just corporate, it was deep and systemic. The power balance shifted as the data finished downloading. I had the keys to the entire city's corruption. I felt a grim, heavy weight of power. Mark begged me to let him go after the transfer. I told him to drive and never look back. He sped away, leaving me alone in the dark with Marcus. My phone buzzed again, but it wasn't a threat this time. It was a message from Cassidy. She was at the police station, and she had a new secret to sell. She claimed she knew where Albert had hidden the physical ledgers. The micro twist was clear. She was ready to betray Albert, too. The cold rain hammered against the parking garage concrete as I read Cassidy's message. She was offering me Albert's head on a silver platter to save her own skin. I looked at Marcus and told him we were heading to the precinct. My objective was finally within reach. I needed those physical ledgers to bury the Richter Empire forever. The truth was no longer a shield. It had become a scythe. We drove through the flooded streets while the city lights blurred into long neon streaks. The precinct lobby was a hive of buzzing fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee. Cassidy sat on a hard plastic chair, looking small and fragile under the clinical glow. She held a battered leather briefcase tight against her chest. When she saw me, her expression didn't soften. She didn't ask for forgiveness or a second chance. She simply tapped the lock on the case. She wanted a deal in writing before she handed over the keys. The victim act was finally over. I sat across from her and watched the clock on the wall. Every tick was a reminder of Albert's reach. I told her that Mark was already in flight, and the offshore accounts were compromised. She smiled a jagged, desperate smile. She admitted that Albert had hidden the ledgers in our old nursery room floor. I had slept inches away from the evidence of my own ruin for months. The irony tasted like copper in my mouth. She pushed the case toward me across the table. Inside the briefcase were handwritten logs and bank statements that bypassed every digital firewall. Albert had kept a physical record of every bribe and every manipulated contract. The power balance shifted with a heavy final thud. I realized I held enough leverage to destroy the city official Mark had mentioned earlier. I looked at Cassidy and told her the lawyers would handle the rest. She asked if she was free to go. I didn't answer. I watched her disappear, knowing the evidence in my hands would be her final undoing as well. The storm broke as I stepped outside the station. The air felt thin and cold. I drove to the park where I used to sit and plan my future. I pulled out my phone and deleted Mark's number. I deleted every photo of Cassidy. The silence in the car was absolute and clean. I realized I didn't need a hero's ending or a grand apology. I just needed the weight of their lies to stop crushing my chest. The war was finally over. I checked my messages one last time before turning the phone off. There was a new notification from an unknown sender. It was a photo of the nursery floor, now ripped open and empty. A single note lay in the dust where the ledgers should have been. Cassidy had played me one last time. The briefcase was a decoy filled with worthless paper, while the true ledgers vanished into the night with a partner I had never even suspected. My brother was not the only ghost in the machine.